now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporates and Investment Banking, proud host of Beyond the Budget 2025, where they are reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Good evening. Welcome to The Money Show this evening. Lots of speculation, concern, maybe a better word, in reporting, quite informed reporting, it seemed to me, over the last sort of 36 hours or so, that you may end up having to pay a little bit more tax. And the reason for that is pretty obvious. If you look at the numbers, this is all publicly available, none of this is secret, you can see that government may have a tax revenue shortfall. If you just consider the fact that unexpectedly the amount of money we were going to have to spend as a society on HIV and AIDS could suddenly be slashed, well, then you see the problem that we're in. Also, of course, a couple of court judgments around SRD payments, the expectation that the social relief of distress grant will have to stay. We all know that it will anyway. And you can just sort of put the numbers together and you can start to see the problems that the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, is going to have. And it is a little bit of a headache. There is no easy option here. If you raise VAT, which is the easiest technically, it's sort of, companies and things can manage that relatively quickly. You get a certain amount of money in. The problem is that it affects the poorer the most, affects poorer people the most because they spend the least amount of money, and it's what's called a regressive tax. If you touch personal finance or personal income, for example, well, fine, slightly more difficult to do. A lot of people feel that they're kind of paying more than their fair share, not getting much for it, etc. And so people who try and avoid tax, evade tax, pick your legal word very carefully, might suddenly start to think that they're not getting a fair deal. There are other things, corporate tax, kind of in line with everybody else, kind of where we wanted to be after a long period of time. Could we raise debt? No, I hear most people saying almost immediately, but not everybody. I know there's some people, I know who you are, who will say that no, we can actually just increase debt. The problem is, and I don't think we talk about this nearly enough, that just increases generational inequality because it's not you and I who might have to pay it. It's our children who will have to pay it. That doesn't seem correct to me. Anyway, there are no easy options here. A lot going on around medical aids. I was slightly astonished to see the story in Business Day this morning. A block exemption being issued by the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, Parks Tau, to medical aid schemes and health funders, or really health funders to use the official word. And it affects prescribed minimum benefits and non-prescribed medical benefits. And how this is going to work is that there will be a sort of committee chaired by someone from the health department, appointed by the Director General of the health department. And that person will determine how this is going to work. And it looks like preparation for the NHI. I just get a sense that the NHI and health, which are already hot-button political issues, are only going to grow in importance and, dare I say, intensity over the next little while. I think a lot is going to happen on that. We'll talk tax in just a second. We'll hear from the CEO of Anglo American Platinum, their big R16.5 billion payout to shareholders as well ahead of their demerger, strange word, from Anglo American. Good to hear from you this evening. I don't know which way you go on the NHI or which way you go when it comes to actual tax increases. If government does need more tax, where would you take it from? 011 883 0702 021 446 0567 and voice notes this evening on 072 702 1702.
The Money Show
With Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
and DSTV channel 856.
So if all of these reports that government's tax revenue is not going to be enough, and if you put the numbers together from what we know, it does look like that could be the case. Does that mean the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, will have to announce tax increases in the budget on Wednesday? There are some other options, but none of them are great. Charles de Wet is an executive at ENS in the tax practice there. Charles, good evening. There seem to be different forecasts about how much government will be short. Are you expecting a big tax shortfall this financial year?
On my analysis of the sort of most recent numbers that are available, tax collections are not quite where they should be, so they're a little bit behind as far as that's concerned, but not substantially behind. So they did an adjustment downwards in November with the medium-term policy framework of sort of 20 or so billion, and on my calculation, they're going to be sort of maybe another 10 or 15 down from that. I thought we were in quite good shape because it looked like the expenditure numbers hadn't increased as much as had been budgeted for. So I thought there was a little bit of room there. But I think what we've seen in the last few days is, the court case on the distress grant that is being appealed, the uncertainty with the US as well. Suddenly that gap that everybody hoped would be there is not there anymore, and now suddenly the minister's in a very difficult place.
So if there is a big shortfall, or a forecast shortfall, if I can call it that, I mean, that's the easiest to implement, right? Despite all the consequences it could have on our society, and there will be consequences.
There will certainly be consequences, and I mean, if there's a shortfall of 20 or 30 billion rand, I mean, sort of a quick way of doing that is to increase the VAT rate from 15% to 16%. So that would collect it quite quickly. I mean, they also what we've seen is on the personal income tax side, there's normally sort of a fiscal drag or a bracket creep adjustment. That could be if that's not granted, and everybody effectively then pays more tax. There could be 15 or 16 billion rand out of that. But those are the only real options that are available if he's really looking for more money.
Sure. There would be intense opposition to any kind of tax increase. I mean, I chuckled to myself, maybe I shouldn't have, when I saw Kasatu and the DA basically saying the same thing. There shouldn't be an increase in VAT. It does tell you how wide and diverse that opposition would be. I don't know how much of that the minister has to take into account. I mean, do you think the numbers will really determine what he has to do, never mind the politics?
I think that is correct. I mean, we do have sort of the first budget of the GNU, so I think there has to be a little bit more, negotiation around that. But at the end of the day, as you said up front, the levers that he can pull are quite limited. We increase borrowings that we can't really afford to do, and we shift the burden on to the next generation. We increase personal tax, but that's sort of quite a small component of the population number of taxpayers that actually makes that contribution. Or you increase the VAT rate, and that's much more broad based and affects everybody. But even though interest rates have come down and inflation's come down, households are under significant pressure and battling to keep above water. And then it does raise the debate. This has been part of the GNU agenda as well, is zero rating additional foodstuffs in the circumstances as well. So even a VAT rate increase, you then have to carve away at that number, because you have to look at what people need to balance their budgets at a household level, which means that more products need to be zero rated, and that there's complexity in that as well.
And if you want to actually increase economic growth, you really don't want to raise taxes anyway. I mean, economic growth is the way out of this problem, and yet by increasing taxes, you slow that down.
That's exactly what you want to do. If you could get economic growth going, if we could get up to 2%, sort of up, double where we are at the moment, then that would solve all the problems. Then there would be revenue, there will tax revenue coming in. There would be more economic activity. There'd be more employment and less money that we'd have to borrow in the circumstances. So that's the solution, and those are the incentives that we need to get the economy moving again.
Charles de Wet, thank you so much. Executive at ENS in the tax practice.
WhatsApp Stephen
on 072
702
1702.
Anglo-American Platinum announcing today it's giving 16.5 billion rand to shareholders. That's ahead of it leaving the Anglo-American group in June. Anglo-American will get a big chunk of that because of the shares in Amplats it still owns. Despite that, the company also announcing a 40% decrease in headline earnings. There is, of course, a softer platinum price and a stronger rand. Earlier today, I spoke to the CEO of Amplats, Craig Miller, and I asked him if this was all about preparing for leaving the Anglo-American group.
We've also had the opportunity to look at our balance sheet, and in anticipation of the demerger, we can bring on some debt into our company, and as a consequence of that, looking at paying a dividend to shareholders. So that comprises of both a base dividend of 40% of our earnings and an additional cash distribution to shareholders in the form of a 59 Rand per share dividend, which will take our total distribution for the second half of the year to 16.5 billion Rand or 19 billion Rand for the full year.
Anglo American, I think they'll have, 19% of your shares after all of this. What's going to happen to them? Do you think they'll keep that interest?
And so, yes, Stephen, Anglo American have indicated that they'll retain about 19.9% shares in Anglo Platinum going forward. And that's really in terms of, them continuing to retain a stake in us and really managing sort of the impact of the demerger and as a result of the distribution of shares to shareholders. And so, yes, as part, which is a relatively normal occurrence when major companies sort of demerge their subsidiaries. And so Anglo American, in time, I imagine, would look to exit that shareholding. But, from at the point of demerger, they'll retain about that 19.9% share.
It leaves you, I think, with 1.1 billion Rand in operating capital. And I did wonder, in this environment, soft platinum prices at the moment, who knows how long that goes on for. Are you confident that's going to be enough?
Yes, so on a pro forma basis, we finished 2024 with about 18 billion Rand in a net cash position. So once we pay the special dividend, and the ordinary dividend will be down to the 1.1 billion of net cash. Certainly, in terms of, when we look at our, the performance of our business and the work that we did in 2024 to really reset our cost base and our capital base, we're confident that, based on where prices are today, we'll be cash flow generative and being able to continue to execute our strategy. But when we look sort of more to the longer term and our sort of beyond sort of the here and now, the fundamentals for PGMs still remain very, very strong. We see the electrification of the drivetrain or future of battery electric vehicles forecast reducing from over 40% by the end of this decade to below 35%, and those forecasts continue to decline, which means that internal combustion engines and hybrid vehicles still have a very meaningful role to play. And on that basis, because of where PGMs are used in catalytic converters, we're very, very excited about the future and the robustness of the PGM market.
Okay, so confidence. I suppose. I can understand why you say all of that. The difficulty is in the timing. Do you have any idea of when you're going to start to see that demand coming through? At the moment, we're seeing really, quite low platinum prices.
Yes, we've certainly seen PGM prices come off their significant highs in both 2021 and 2022. But actually in 2024, PGM prices were relatively stable. So although they were 13% down year on year, throughout the whole of 2024, they were stable. But at these prices, we don't think that they're sustainable, just given the fact that both the platinum, palladium, and rhodium markets are in a deficit. You don't see significant amounts of new supply coming to market. And because of those changes in assumptions with regards to battery electric vehicles, that should, you're going to see deficits being maintained in these markets, which is unsustainable at current price levels. And therefore, prices will need to rise in order to bring in some additional supply to meet future demand.
Your earnings were down 40%, and a lot of that you can't control because of platinum prices, because of the rand. Your production was down slightly. You had a restructuring too. Are you expecting to keep operations at their current levels for the foreseeable future then, if you're so bullish on the sort of medium to longer term outlook?
Yes, we provided our 3-year guidance today as well, and we're anticipating maintaining production at the current levels. So, following the restructuring that we did last year, our expectation is that we'll be able to maintain production and then continue to invest into the business for the longer term. And as you've pointed out, our earnings were down 40%, but some of that is on the back of the PGM prices and then sort of some of the one-off costs that we've incurred as part of the restructuring and anticipation of the demerger.
Craig Miller, thank you very much indeed. CEO at Anglo American Platinum.
The Money Show.
The Markets.
Arthur Karras is Portfolio Manager at Old Mutual for Macro Solutions at Old Mutual Investments. Arthur, good evening to you. Anglo American Platinum, 16.5 billion Rand going back to shareholders, and obviously a lot to come in that company over the next few months.
Yes, in fact, it's a part of a very long process. If we think back to Anglo-American, like maybe 20, 30 years ago, it's basically continued to refine its own business, and it's now probably in the final stages of that, when you're going to be left with just an iron ore and a copper business. As far as Anglo-American Platinum is concerned, they have been sitting with quite a bit of cash on their balance sheet, and it obviously makes sense to reduce that because that improves the returns for shareholders. It also means that Anglo-American get some of that cash before they lose control of that business.
Yeah, I mean, I presume that was a big part of it. The outlook for platinum, though, I mean, you might have heard Craig Miller being quite bullish over the medium term. Obviously, no one really knows when that turn-up will come.
That's absolutely true. And I think one of the difficulties that one has when looking at any a commodity outlook is trying to predict the demand. And when it comes to platinum, we know that we're probably going to have less petrol-engined and diesel-engined cars in the future, even if they don't go away. We don't know how big or how meaningful the hydrogen economy is going to be. So there's quite a few questions there that we can't answer. But what we do know is that people aren't really building any new mines for platinum. There isn't any investment going into that. And all the money that is being spent on new mines is essentially there to replace old production, mines that are dying out. So the fact that there's not any large investment in platinum happening right now, that by itself is it's a pretty good indicator that if the demand is there in future, there's not necessarily going to be lots of supply to meet that demand, and that should help prices go up.
Takes a little while to prospect for platinum and send down a mine shaft, doesn't it? So that gives you some time too. Afrimat, their profit was down, and they've had quite a big year. They bought Eiffage.
So Afrimat, really an operational update, so not much in the way of numbers outside some of the operational things. They've got quite a few things on the go. They're busy working on a plan to make their commodity anthracite mine more sustainable and more efficient. They bought Lafarge cement business not too long ago, and they've put a lot of work in there to improve that business. So those are two things that I think would help underpin profits in the future. But right now they're finding they're not able to sell as much iron ore to both because of the rail network is struggling and because of their big local customers struggling as well. So that's going to affect their profits in the short term.
Quantum Foods, they produce eggs. Well, the chickens they own produce eggs, I should say. Quite a nice recovery after the avian influenza problem they had last year.
Yes, that's a basic product. But even out of the US, we're hearing stories about egg prices going up dramatically. It's very much something that we all eat a lot of, and there's still a whole big business behind it trying to produce it. They're indicating that they're going to have a better year. Again, an operational update rather than a financial one, so we can't really tell the quantums, but they're producing 70% more eggs than what they did in the prior period, even though egg prices have declined by some 13%. Because of better availability, it does sound like their profits are going to be much better in the next period than before.
Arthur Karras, thanks very much indeed. Really appreciate it. Portfolio manager at Macro Solutions at Old Mutual Investments. Interesting, of course, to see just what happens with the price of eggs. Went so high a couple of years ago, 18 months ago, slowly coming down, pretty much come down to those levels. That's had a big impact on food price inflation. Actually, was one of the reasons that food price inflation started to come down. The fact that egg prices had normalized in the last year. You're with The Money Show, 6:30.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth at Beyond the Budget 2025.
18 minutes now to 7 the time, 011 883 0702 021 446 0567. I don't know if you have an idea of where tax to make up the revenue shortfall should come from. I mean, should it go straight, come off that, everybody pays? Should it come off somewhere else? Should it come off corporate tax? Should it come sort of off personal income tax? Lots of reasons why we should do all of those things and shouldn't do any of them. I don't know if you have a strong view. I was thinking today of what was going on in the kind of green room, if they have one, or the preparation room or the holding room or the meeting room backstage before this meeting between the Chinese President Xi Jinping and some of the people who lead China's tech industry. We'll hear a bit more about it in a few moments. It's an important meeting. It's an important signal he was sending. He was basically saying that his government is working with them, and they're saying we're working with the Chinese government. I mean, there's nothing wrong with this. It's exactly what's happening in the United States at the moment. If you think it's just about Elon Musk, go and look at some pictures of, the inauguration of US President Donald Trump. What I'm trying to get to, though, is I kind of wonder what they said to each other behind the scenes, if anything. I mean, you all know what happened to the head of Alibaba, Jack Ma. I mean, he seemed to disappear for a little while, and that couldn't have happened without Xi knowing about it and wanting it to happen. It would seem. I just wonder what they say. All of this goes to transparency, which goes to confidence, which goes to the biggest problem the Chinese economy seems to have right now, which is a lack of confidence, and that may well be underpinned by a lack of transparency.
702. Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
A report in Business Day this morning, the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, Park Stow, gazetting what's called an interim block exemption for medical aids. It applies both to prescribed minimum benefits and non-prescribed minimum benefits. Essentially, as I understand the report, healthcare funders would be able to bypass parts of the Competition Act so they can fix prices or they can divide markets, but it's through a new body that would be chaired by an official from the Health Department. The other members of the body would be appointed by the Director General of Health. Dr. Rajesh Patel is the head of Health System Strengthening at the Board of Healthcare Funders. Rajesh, good evening to you, and thank you for your time. I mean, when I first saw this headline, it seemed to maybe actually give your industry a bit more power. Obviously, when you go further into it, it seems a lot more complicated than that. What do you think is going on here?
Good evening, Stephen, and good evening to the listeners. Yeah, this is long overdue. In fact, it was recommended by the Health Market Inquiry when they published their recommendations 2019. But then you sit and wonder why nothing has happened up till now. I think the initiative and what kickstarted this is that BHF applied for an exemption 3 years ago. And it's taken the Competition Commission 3 years to get to this conclusion. And there was some resistance, and obviously we won't go into the details of those resistance and where the resistance had come from. But I think, there's pros and cons to what's been published at the moment. And, yeah, we can go into those detailed discussions. But, yeah, it's been a long journey to get to this point. I think, there's a history to this whole thing. And, yes, it started with the Competition Commission. And we think that there is pros in these regulations, but there's a lot of cons as well.
Okay, let's go into that in a second. But first, do you think the timing has got anything to do with the NHI?
I think the timing's probably got to do with a lot of pressure on the Department of Health and the government to try and find a solution to the rising costs in healthcare, which they've neglected for the last 2 decades in terms of making any kind of health reforms for the private sector.
Okay, so not necessarily the NHI, but the intent is the same.
Yeah, potentially. I think the pressure is probably far born in this scenario.
Okay. I mean, obviously, you would then welcome the idea that you could sort of fix selling prices. The problem is, from your point of view, and I'm presuming here, I'm asking you, is it that the Health Department seems to chair this body and seems to have quite a lot of influence over this body? In fact, they'll decide who's on it.
Yeah, I think, to some extent, there was an exemption applied, given by the Competition Commission Minister at that point in time, which was particularly for COVID pandemic at that point in time. And we thought that was a good starting point, to develop this kind of framework, working with everyone together with this common thing in mind, starting small with COVID and then expanding it out. But even at that time when that exemption was given, Department of Health did nothing. So I get the sense that they were the ones who were actually reluctant to implement this. When we applied for exemption, they were the ones that actually objected to the BHF exemption application at that point in time. So the fact that they've now conceded and are willing to go ahead with this is a positive sign.
Okay. What difference do you expect it to make for the end user? I mean, on one level, no one really likes to get around the Competition Act. The whole point that the Competition Act is there is to make prices lower for the end user. Do you think this will result in lower prices for the end user?
Well, remember one thing, competition is great kind of thing for commodities where you have a choice. But for services and things like that where you don't have much choice and where it's essential component, then I think where the competition theory may not necessarily apply. I think if you look at examples, bread, milk, healthcare, these are essential services for which competition, it goes up, to one maximum tolerable price. I think given the scenario and the framework, there are positives to it. One, there's suggestion of a ceiling price. Like you mentioned in your introduction, that it will cover both prescribed minimum benefits and non-prescribed minimum benefits, which was not included at the time of the health market inquiry. I think what they do make reference to is that people can negotiate outside of this framework as long as it is to lower the price further down. So that's positive. The things we don't necessarily like and we think might put pressure on prices going up is the fact that they talk about a cost methodology, which has some methodological weaknesses. An example I'm going to give you is, you can be driving a Bentley, I could drive a Mercedes, but something like a Toyota could take us from A to B. So, who should be paying for preferences, and should you be pricing structure based on what is reasonable and fair? And I think that's important to consider. With regards to this framework, what they are suggesting is that health facilities are excluded from this negotiation scenario. But health facilities represent sort of 50 to 60% of costs, which means this negotiation framework only applies to that 40-45% of costs. So how much are you going to really push costs downwards? I think that's one of the big problems, that we need to introduce hospital facilities to be part of this negotiating framework, force them to the table, because that's where there's a lot of problems in terms of price transparency and potentially a lot more room to bring prices down.
Between the recommendations of the health market inquiry, as you say, 3 years ago now, and the gazetting over the weekend, Friday, I presume, was there any consultation? Did you know this was coming?
Well, they were giving us a lot of reasons why there was delay in decision making, and the Competition Commission repeatedly told us they were working towards block exemption. Now, in reality, we as BHF, and there were 3 other service provider groups that applied for exemption. Competition Commission was supposed to evaluate our individual submission and make a decision on whether they do approve or don't approve. The fact that the health market inquiry was recommending a framework such as this shouldn't really influence them into making a decision. They should have, at an earlier stage, maybe about a year after we applied, sort of said yes or no. And I think, the 2 years or period that it took them to come to the decision of rejecting our application, not just ours, I think of all the provider groups that applied as well, was mainly because they wanted to drive this block exemption and create this kind of framework under the Department of Health to oversee negotiations. We had told them, give us the exemption, let us negotiate with any willing provider. And yes, if you think that it's non-transparent, we're happy to invite consumer bodies, trade unions to round the table, so that even government can sit around the table to see that the negotiations are handled on the basis that's what's best for the consumer out there.
Dr. Rajesh Patel, thank you. Really appreciate the time. Head of the Health System Strengthening at the Board of Healthcare Funders. There are so many different moving parts within health at the moment. To try and sort of unpick which relates to what can be quite complex, but very, very important to keep an eye on some of these technical changes.
702. Stephen is on X.
At Stephen Grootes.
An interesting meeting today. Would have loved to have known what was going on behind the scenes, involving the Chinese President Xi Jinping and a collection of China's tech titans, including the founder of Alibaba, Jack Ma, who seemed to sort of disappear a couple of years ago, then came back. It does come in the context of some evidence that China's economy may be slowing. Certainly, there seems to be a deliberate attempt by the Chinese government to stimulate their economy. Some of it does seem to be related to issues in the property sector. Professor David Mazwai is a professor of international relations and a foreign policy expert at the University of Johannesburg, watches China in particularly very carefully. David, good evening. Good to talk to you again. What do you think President Xi wanted to get out of this meeting? Why would he want to appear so publicly with these particular people?
This is quite an interesting meeting. It comes at the backdrop of President Trump's own inauguration, where tech giants were displayed. So in a way, it's a response of President Xi Jinping after many years in which he had regulated the entire tech industry to demonstrate to the world, as he has said to these tech giants, that They need to be more confident in Chinese development model, as well as markets, as well as dealing with issues of security. A number of factors are at play at the moment, given the rivalry between the U.S. and China.
I wondered if the timing might just be a little bit late. Now, look, I mean, there could be other factors, but if you consider the fuss around DeepSeek, which came out almost a month ago now, you would think that maybe it would have been better to have this, straight after, hit while the iron was hot. I know there was the Lunar New Year, but you could still have done this 10 days ago.
Yeah, you could have done, but I mean, as you know, with the Chinese, they always play a long-term kind of game. But it's a matter of maximum demonstration of the superiority of their technology that the world is starting to embrace. I mean, it comes at a perfect time also to send a message not only to President Trump, but to the world that we are coming in big time. And you can see the names that were lined up. I mean, your Huawei, all names and companies that are there, they're countering the U.S. And the bigger question for the rest of the world is that what kind of a world we're getting in? You're going to have your Chinese model of technology as well as the American. With the conference that took place in France, the bigger question is that what are the rules of the game? Who's going to dominate tech going forward is the question we have, and we don't have answers to it.
Well, I mean, yeah, and it doesn't seem there are many rules of the game. How close is the relationship, do you think, in reality between the Chinese government and the sort of people in charge of its tech industry at the moment? I mean, we see how close they are in the United States. Are they that close in China?
They're quite close, private, and however, I think unlike the U.S. and most Western world, the tech giants in China is well regulated in terms of protection of data and certain rules. And the mere fact that no one is much bigger than the Chinese Communist Party, I think the rules are very clear in a way, unlike your Facebook and the like, who are so free and they behave as if they are states in certain instances, undermining sovereign states. They are regulated in a way internally, as well as they move globally. There are certain rules, of which, whether it's President Trump or Western world, they're starting to see certain positive elements of this regulation of a big tech giant.
Okay. I mean, there's a lot coming out of the White House around China. So we all know Trump's imposed stricter tariffs. The State Department recently removed a line on their website. So it was a line that explicitly said the U.S. does not support independence for Taiwan. It's now removed that line that said that explicitly. It looks like, I don't know how to put this, David, it looks to me as a journalist, not an economist, that the U.S. could be in for a period, I think, of social discord. We've got possible peace between Russia and Ukraine without the Ukrainians, but really the Americans and Russia. I mean, how does Beijing view all of this? As you say, big fans of the long game, may welcome some of it, may be a bit nervous about how quickly it's happening.
Yeah, things are quite changing. I mean, if you follow what J.D. Vance, the vice president of the U.S., he made it quite clear that what we know, NATO and Europe and the usual traditional transatlantic relationship is not as important as it used to be under President Trump. The new threat to U.S. security is its own domestic threat, border with Mexico as well as China. And therefore, there's that shift by President Trump looking directly and trying to compete with China militarily as well as economic. I think for the Chinese, they see a lot of opportunities and challenges that they might be built on the economic front. But when it comes to military, it will be really, really tough. And that specific line that you have mentioned, it's perhaps the right time to move in Taiwan. Since the moment, I do not think that Trump will really put troops on the ground to defend Taiwan. However, he might sell more weapons. So those opportunities and challenges for President Xi Jinping.
Is that, do you think, likely? I mean, there would still be a war one way or another if he went for Taiwan?
It's not given. I do not think that President Trump is into war at the moment.
No, sure, but Taiwan would wage war. There would still be a war.
They will, but I think the lessons, Taiwanese are quite smart. I think they're seeing what's happening to Ukrainians. And they're of the view that if they go to war openly with China, their country will be destroyed in a way, as we see with Ukraine. That 3 years, regardless of issues that they raise, they are left more poorer. They lost 1/5 of their country. And as it appears, President Putin has an upper hand as we speak.
Indeed. Professor David Munyai, thank you very much indeed. Very sobering international relations and foreign policy expert at the University of Johannesburg. In a moment, should government be giving more money to SOEs? You're going to raise taxes on the one side, Minister, and give some money to SOEs on the other? We'll find out more at 7 o'clock.
And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud host of Beyond the Budget 2025, where they are reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Good evening. Welcome to the second hour. Don't forget, we'll be speaking to Andile Mazwai. He's done all sorts of things. Currently chair of Bidvest, CEO of CBD Investments. It's a property fund in Joburg. He started, though, in the liquor industry. I think many people did, frankly, because there were so few opportunities at the time. But he's someone who started there in the Eastern Cape, ended up moving to Joburg, and really hasn't looked back since. Astonishing story. We'll hear from him about his journey with money, what it was like, how it was, how his life has changed over the years. I always find that actually to be sometimes the most interesting question when you ask it. Not everybody will answer it, but certainly I find that interesting. Your questions for Andile Mazwai, 011 8830 702 021 446 0567. We'll talk about SOEs in just a moment. I know, I'm aware, sorry. Also, it's a fascinating book, author of The Black Pioneers, The Untold Stories of African Merchants, Pakamisan Zamela. We did try to speak to him about 2 months ago. He had problems that night, but we'll speak to him this evening. It's a really interesting book, tells you some really interesting stories. Lots to come on The Money Show tonight.
702. Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Well, the budget speech on Wednesday, again questions about whether there'll be any more money or bailouts or debt guarantees or whatever you want to call it, your money going to state-owned entities. You know the long list of SOEs that have guzzled money from you over the years. Could I remind you of SAA? Do I need to? Transnet, the post office. The list is incredibly long. And once again, for example, we've heard from people at the post office that without more money, it will simply collapse. Let's speak to the independent analyst, Kaya Satole. Kaya, good to talk to you tonight. Good evening. Is there any reason this time around to give money to SOEs that say they need it?
Well, it's a difficult one because, as you would remember, Stephen, every business has to find a way of making sure that it is financially viable. So it's either you are able to get that financial viability on the basis of your own operations, having a sound commercial mandate helps that. And in instances where that is not possible, then your shareholder has to step up and figure out whether you've got the right business model, and if so, what needs to be done in order to capitalize that business. Unfortunately, when it comes to state-owned entities, that shareholder happens to be you and I. And of course, when these particular entities then make an approach to say that we need more money, it's a question of, well, how did you get here? And the stories are long and varied. And ultimately, the call has to be made on whether that money will indeed be advanced. But when you have a portfolio of over 700 state entities, it is inevitable that some will be regarded as important enough to entertain and others simply are not regarded as important enough to entertain. And it is in that balancing act where the finance minister at every budget has to figure out which one to prioritize and how much to give to them, and more importantly, what the basis of that particular exchange needs to be. And in recent years, it's become a bit of a pointless exchange in that the minister would say that, look, I will only give the bailout if you behave differently. And inevitably, for as long as you maintain the same political oversight systems, it's difficult to imagine how these entities can behave differently.
I mean, strange things happen, right? We were told that if the post office didn't get money by the end of October, it would close its doors. A funny thing, Kai. I mean, I haven't been to a post office for ages, but I saw a postal worker on a bicycle in my area last month, and either that person shouldn't have the bicycle or it's still operating.
Well, it is still operating, and I think there's been yet another request to say that, look, we need that particular amount as soon as possible, and if not, we're not going to survive much longer. So what the business rescue team has been trying to do is that they've been trying to keep the lights on using a variety of techniques, closing down some of the operations and also obviously offloading some of those items that they didn't think were core to the purpose. But unfortunately, that is not a sustainable model. It is a model that simply gets you so far. And in this particular instance, I think we are reaching a particular decision-making stage where a call has to be made on whether the post office will be rescued or not. And I think government probably cannot afford to kick it much longer down the can. It doesn't help the business rescue team, unfortunately, that they've been able to do it so far, because the politicians are simply going to say, well, you said that last year and you managed to carry on, so perhaps whatever you did to carry on, just keep doing it.
I mean, there's a problem with being too successful. We are seeing some SOEs that can recover. So Eskom's an important story. Transnet's maybe doing the same thing. If SOEs, if there's a way, if there's a model to make sure an SOE recovers, you would like to think that maybe it'll make it easier for others to recover. And again, each case will be different. Eskom really, I suppose, is the very definition of too big to fail. But you would like to think there'll be more intense pressure on the people running SOEs to make sure that actually they do run more effectively, because some have been shown to recover.
Yeah, and you know that type of pressure is supposed to be the positive pressure that gets replicated across the system. Unfortunately, what happens across the system is that the different ministers and different portfolios are overseen quite differently, and there are particular state-owned entities that everybody knows are not strategically important enough for us to keep bailing them out at every turn. And it is those particular ones where the pressure to be financially viable on their standalone basis should be much higher, but you don't see that happening. So if you think of the SAA story, for example, how we went into business rescue, is that National Treasury looked around and said, look, guys, 30 years ago, we opened up the sector, private players have come in, and private players have managed to find a way to survive and thrive. So therefore, that actually then reduced the strategic importance of that particular entity. In other words, even if things do go wrong, if it does go into business rescue, even shuts down, the sector won't collapse overnight. So that means that the pressure, the internal pressure on an SAA, for example, should have been much greater on the basis that it couldn't rely on the support of a benevolent shareholder. It is a completely different story when it comes to Eskom and Transnet, but even with that one of the tension points that we have, Stephen, is that we as citizens are sometimes complicit in actually creating long-term problems. So if you look at what Eskom says in its tariff applications, Eskom says we would be viable on a standalone basis if we got this particular tariff. But when the regulator then comes back and says, well, actually the number is different, it simply means that Eskom then has to deal with the question of, well, what do you prioritize in the short term? What do you do in the long term in order to balance the books? And if an entity of that nature has to sacrifice on its maintenance plans and its capital expenditure, then you actually are simply deferring the consequences to a much later time, and those consequences are unavoidable.
We've seen a few squabbles in the current national coalition already. We haven't yet seen, as far as I'm aware, I know you pay more attention to these things than I do, we haven't yet seen a big squabble over the composition of a board of an SOE, and I wonder if that will come. And this takes us to the heart of a different question, which is whether SOE governance and board appointments in a coalition government might, over time, be slightly different to what we saw before.
Well, we actually do have a process that is pending, and that is the National State Enterprises Bill, and one of its key focus areas is what the right and appropriate governance model should be for strategic state entities. That particular bill will become the very important document, because I think it will be one of the first big pieces of legislation that comes in the aftermath of the GNU, because every other bill that we've been debating in the past few months were bills that were actually finalized in the previous parliament, where the sense of collaboration didn't have to exist. So this one, when it then gets ventilated, you're then going to see what the different perspectives of the different political parties that make up the GNU are, and whether that leads us onto a better lawmaking process, whether that leads us onto a better governance model for state-owned entities. That is what we have to wait and see.
I mean, the big risk is that everyone is so risk averse, everyone's so scared of all of the disasters that we've seen, that you'll actually just put, you'll just sort of straitjacket, put too tight boundaries around anyone who can make a decision at an SOE, because everyone will be so worried that what will happen is it'll be a disaster.
Exactly. And the problem with having too much of that is that you unfortunately are going to deter the most competent and the most well-meaning people from taking on these jobs, because they'll say, look, I operate well, I thrive well, I've run businesses, I've run successful businesses under these particular parameters. I do not believe that these parameters will be made available in this particular entity, so therefore I will not be able to step in. You've had some exceptions. I think Vuyani Jahana, when he left Vodacom and tried to do that at SAA, he was really hoping that he'd be able to overcome some of those structural limitations. But I think obviously at the core of those structural limitations is what politicians believe they should have as an over-amplified influence onto how these institutions are run, and whether they have the understanding of the distinction between creating the policy environment and then interfering with the boardroom. I don't know if we've got the politicians that have that acute understanding. The one exception, Stephen, has actually been the SABC, but that exception was created through litigation, where it had to be the courts that said to a Minister of Communications, well, you actually do not have these unilateral veto powers over the composition of the board, similarly to the President to say once Parliament has come up with a short list, that is what you have to work with. You do not have to second-guess the process. But that has been an exception brought by litigation. Other entities are still, unfortunately, subject to the prevailing whims of politicians.
Kaya Satole, really appreciate that. Thank you very much indeed. The independent analyst. Well, we'll find out, of course, in the budget on Wednesday. Where will you hear the budget? Right here.
702 with Stephen Grootes.
Email him on stephen@702.co.za.
On the next Money Show, Kumba Iron Ore's Chief Executive Mpumi Zikalala will take us through the mining company's year-end financial results. Personal finance expert and co-founder of Galileo Capital, Warren Ingram, will answer a question on whether you should own a paid-off home before retirement or not. Is a house a good asset or a longer-term liability? You can also send in your personal finance question early for Warren to answer. Also, the latest business news from around our continent, our Africa Business Focus with Dr. Rotendo Ndwengwi, the founding director at Tribe Africa Advisory. All of that and more on The Money Show.
The Money Show.
Business books.
Well, a book came across my desk. In fact, it's been lying on my desk for quite some time, partly because I won't let the people who want to borrow it, for the moment at least. It's called Black Pioneers, The Untold Stories of African Merchants. It's by Phakamisa Nzamela. It's a coffee table book. It's a big book. Has written a book on a previous vein before, and it really does tell you some of the more interesting stories around business in our history. Phakamisa Nzamela joins me now. Phakamisa, good morning. Good evening. Good to have you with us. It's an important book. Why did you decide to publish this book now? What was driving that thought?
Good evening to you and the Talk Radio 702 listeners, Stephen, and thank you very much for this opportunity. Well, how did this come about? Well, the legacy managers of one of the leading banks in South Africa wanted to showcase the audacity of black business people in the 1960s and the 1970s, that is during hard apartheid. And I was approached by two gentlemen, Spusiso Khumalo and Andile Khumalo, obviously carrying the blessings of Kennedy Bongani and Thabo Joti. And essentially they wanted a book that would tell the story of black business pioneers during those hard days. You remember the 60s. Many people were exiled. The Mandelas were sent to Robben Island. Political organizations were banned. And that is how it was conceived.
Okay, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And you wrote Native Merchants, the Building of the Black Business Class in South Africa. I'm presuming some of those stories were kind of the colonial era and before apartheid. Did you notice a big difference between the two eras and the people in those eras?
Correct, Stephen. I mean, if you look at Native Merchants, the Building of the Black Business Class in South Africa, which was my first book, that book touches on black economic activity and entrepreneurship from the pre-colonial period. Call it the Mapungube years, the 12th century to the 1800s, hoteliers, bus merchants. This book, Black Pioneers, The Untold Stories of African Merchants, is about black business people who pioneered in the 1960s and 70s. You might ask yourself, why do you call them black pioneers when you had black business people in the 1800s or 1600s that I had already written about? But these men and women, if you think about it, they pioneered a first black-controlled bank registered by the South African Reserve Bank or at the South African Reserve Bank. They pioneered cinema houses, if you think about HMBG. They were coal merchants, so they were pioneers in their time. And of course, they pioneered the National African Federated Chamber of Commerce, uniting all black business people across the country to work together and, build businesses together.
Did you notice certain personality traits they had in common, certain things that people in Black Pioneers, in your book Black Pioneers, all had? I mean, obviously to try and start a business at the time, for them in their position, in the position that they were forced to be in, was incredibly difficult. I mean, were there certain things that you could see they all had in common among them?
First, it's audacity. They had the courage to start, despite their social background or standing in community. I mean, some people were domestic workers. If you think about P.K. Siabela, who ran a printing business in central Johannesburg before the Group Areas Act expelled him out of there. If you think about HMPG, he was a domestic worker. So these are people who started with nothing. That's one commonality: no trust fund, limited access to funding. The other commonality is that they were able to raise funds, working together to build something big. Third commonality, of course, they never just whinged and complained. They had the urge to start. And you'll remember, Stephen, this was before the promulgation of the Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Act of 2003, or the amended version of 2013. So I would say the common word would be audacity to start.
It's so interesting to compare the position of people then and now. And I know there will be an argument from some who would say it's never been easier to start a business. And yet that's not the experience of people who are trying to start businesses right now. I mean, if you look at the situation facing people who are trying to start businesses now, in some ways it seems not harder than then, obviously, but still incredibly difficult. I mean, I don't think you can really compare them, but I know some people want to manage that, will want to make those comparisons.
It's honestly difficult to compare, Stephen. These are different epochs, right? Someone might argue that with the advent of technology, it's become more competitive and difficult. But it was always difficult for Black business people to start businesses. Let's start there, right? And people didn't stop at saying it's difficult. And that's what I'm trying to do with this book, especially on young people, Stephen, to say, listen, you can start. If someone who had to quit school in standard 6 or in primary school started something in the hardest days, what stops you from starting? Of course, the lesson here is that people started small, Stephen. If you look at HMPG, who had a cinema business, he starts as a domestic worker, right? And he starts beaming a projector in the garage of his bosses, for the lack of a better word. And he captures the market of fellow domestic servants, right? To beam these movies or project these movies. If you think about Maponya, right? He did milk. He knew how milk worked. He had shepherded cows when he was young, and of course he had the experience of knowing how to preserve milk. He starts a milk business. So these are people who leveraged on what society taught them. I'd certainly not give young people today any pass, Stephen. I know it's hard, but if people could do it when Black people were burned, what stops them from doing it now?
Phakamisa, thank you. Congratulations on the book. Phakamisa Nzimela is the author of Black Pioneers, The Untold Stories of African Merchants.
7:02.
7:02.
Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
In a moment, Andile Mazwai, the chair of Bidvest Bank, also CEO of CBD Investments, an astonishing journey. Looking forward to hearing it in his words. He'll tell you about his journey with money and, of course, ask him, well, let's see what he says. What did he waste money on? What were his best ever money that he ever spent? Looking forward to Andile Mazwai in just a moment. You're with The Money Show. Good evening. It's 7:30.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth at Beyond the Budget 2025.
24 minutes now to 8 the time. You know, of course, what we do at this time on a Monday. We discuss someone's journey with money. And my great pleasure, dare I say privilege, to welcome to our studio this evening Andile Mazwai. He's currently chair of Bidvest Bank. He's a board member at Alexander Forbes. He's CEO of CBD Investments. I could tell you the list of things that he's done, but we only have 23 minutes left and we're not going to have time. Andile, good evening. Thanks so much for coming through. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Stephen, thank you very much for having me. It is an absolute delight to be here.
You started in the Eastern Cape. Well, glad I got that right. Do you remember, and I mean, you know, one of the sort of first headlines of your story that pops out is that, you know, the first thing you did was run a bottle store, right? But before that, we'll get to that. Do you remember where you were, what you were doing when you first realized what money was? You know, did you see a transaction? Did you see money changing hands? Did you realize people did things for this or that this mattered? I mean, can you remember? We a long time ago, I suppose. Not that long.
Vividly. I was always fascinated by money. And I just did not know what it was. You know, it's like that. I know what the time is, but I don't know what time is. So we all know what money can do, but what is it? And I was sitting in an economics lecture, probably 101, at UCT, and I read a definition of money: the command over goods and services.
Sure.
And it just stuck. And I was like, I now know what money is.
It's a very simple definition.
Yeah, very simple, but had a profound impact on the way that I then related with money.
I can imagine, because, I mean, you had been, I presume, engaging and transacting in money long before then.
Yeah, the family had trading stores. So holidays was standing behind a till. When you were young, on a crate behind a till. And as you got older, you could dispense with the crate. So yeah, standing behind a till and exchanging was normal.
Was that a big part, do you think, of your sense of self? The fact that you were part of a family that was doing that, and so as a result, I mean, you know, families affect children growing up in them in all sorts of ways. Was that a big part of you?
It was. I knew that it wasn't the norm, but it was normal for me. So that trading, you buy at a lower price, you sell at a higher price, that there are some costs that are fixed and there are some costs that are variable. That, without being taught, was just something which I learned standing behind the till of the family businesses. It was liquor stores and filling stations.
And I mean, you also get very good with money. And by which I mean counting it, what happens if it goes missing, what it is, how it works. I mean, that kind of sense must be quite important, I think.
It really was. The illiteracy rate in South Africa remains high. And what I learned then is that there's so many people who were illiterate. The way they related with money is that they knew that if I had a brown piece of paper and I bought this good, my change should be a green paper, a big coin and a small coin. So without being able to read, they could actually figure it out from the color, the shape, and the sizes of money. And I think that is to the point that you're making, that even if you don't consciously understand what you're doing, subconsciously there's a way in which you relate with it that then makes sense to you.
So even without being able to read, you have command and control over goods and services, essentially.
Indeed you do. Indeed you do.
So you were at school in the Eastern Cape, I presume?
School in KZN. Home was now I'm giving my age away. It wasn't KZN, it was Natal. It wasn't the Eastern Cape, it was Transkei. But yes, KZN and Eastern Cape is home and school.
What were you thinking about doing when you were leaving high school? I mean, what did you have? Did you know you would have looked around at your options, and the country was beginning to change, I suppose, in some ways, but may not have felt like it. Probably didn't really. But what were you sort of thinking of doing? Was it always going to be something in commerce for you?
It was. Sure, it was just at that time when the country was transitioning. So my getting into a UCT, for example, was, had it been a few years earlier, would have been a lot more difficult. So I just came in with that first wave, if you would. So it was, the option set was limited. So that accounting, my parents always told me that I have this thing about money and I love money, therefore I should be an accountant. It's like, that's the only thing you can do. So I then read a BCom in accounting, and then along the way I discovered that there were other things other than accounting, even in the commercial route.
I mean, so many people I know who studied accounting say it's just, the hardest thing they've done, especially at sort of university level. And your experience at the time, I mean, UCT was changing too. It had a sort of reputation among some people, but it still wasn't really reflective of the country at all. And you were among a first generation of people.
No, it wasn't. And perhaps my own personal story is just that I lived in these two worlds. That on the one hand, I'm just a boy from a rural village, Lusigisigi, in the Transkei, but I'm also a private school kid sitting in a lecture hall at UCT.
Sure.
And I'm both. And so I then had to find my way in both of those environments, that I had to be authentic in each of those environments. And while it may have been difficult at the time, I think that the lesson that comes out of it is the ability to navigate a country as curious as ours.
Interesting. I use the word interesting. To go from private school, UCT, to running a bottle store.
Yes.
In the rural Eastern Cape. Was it in Lusikisiki?
In Lusikisiki.
That's a real difference. I mean, that really is quite a journey. I mean, you kind of back to where you started, but it's still a journey.
It is. And again, because these two worlds coexisted for me. So I'd gotten to master's level at UCT, and all I then had to do was hand in my dissertation. So go home, write the dissertation, and hand it in. And of course, when I'm at home, do I have the luxury of sitting in the lounge all day? No, you got to go and get behind the till. So there I was working, and then there was an opportunity that the other owner of a bottle store was looking for a buyer. I mean, there are only 2 liquor stores in town. So you go to the other owner. So it was an easy enough acquisition for the family. I mean, I was just a member of the family. And that's how I then got my liquor store in the Eastern Cape while writing my dissertation at the same time.
It must be unique for the time. I can't think of anyone who was doing that, both of those things at the same time.
It was an unlikely combination.
Sure. So then you came to Joburg.
Yeah.
And you ended up in equities.
Yes.
I think there might have been a reason why you came to Joburg. Maybe a person, I can't remember. But you came to Joburg and you ended up working in equities. How did you make that journey into equities?
There may have been a girl in the story. I don't remember clearly. But a dear friend of mine, we're at UCT together, and I was in Joburg, and we're just chatting.
Yeah.
And he happened to have a copy of the Financial Mail, as one does, on his coffee table, and we went through it. And I wanted a real job. My parents had spent a lot of money getting me a fancy education, so running a liquor store in rural Transkei, I don't think it's a dream they had for me. And there was an advert in the Financial Mail for a junior trader in a company called Barnard Jacob Millet. And we looked at each other. My mate says to me, I think you'd be a good trader. And I'm like, what do equity traders do? And that is how that story began.
Sure. And people became to know you through that role for quite a long time. Did you find it? Did you enjoy it immediately? I mean, it's very similar to what you'd been doing your whole life in some ways.
Yeah, I did have a knack for it. I really did enjoy it. The idea that you see a gap, you buy something at one price, you sell it as soon as you can at a better price. That did come to me quite easily. It wasn't foreign at all, and I just loved it. But a lot more zeros, louder voices. Yeah, almost like the movies. No, I really did enjoy it.
Is there a buzz to it?
There's.
Do you miss it?
I do.
I was going to get so much more out of that section.
I really do. No, and perhaps part of the nostalgia is that as time goes, systems change, and you don't get guys in a room shouting at each other. It's guys punching away at keyboards and algorithms and AI, and it's really automated. So yeah, a lot of that interpersonal trading just simply doesn't exist anymore. So therefore, it does become more romantic in my memory.
You started to sort of move up the corporate ladder. You became CEO eventually. There was a sort of deal, things like that. How was all of that? I mean, it must have been quite interesting, quite fun. Was it ever a bit scary? Did you ever think this might all come to a little bit of a juddering halt and I'm going to have to go back to Lusiki Siki? I mean, were there nervous moments?
I'd say 3 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I felt like I knew exactly what I was doing. But then you get that crisis of confidence. Thursday, Friday, you think I'm in over my head. I was blessed to have a mentor in Paul Barnard, the Barnard of Barnard Jacobs Millet, who saw in me something that I was a long way from seeing in myself. And he backed me. And he just really said, it's those days when you think, why me? Why am I doing this? Do I know what I'm doing? And he just continually kept me believing that what I was doing when he was a co-investor in the business, that what we were doing actually had legs and that it would work. So yeah, I remain forever grateful to Paul Barnard and the confidence that he had in me.
And leading a group of people. I always find that interesting because I think, there's so many books about leadership and I sometimes think they can't all be right. Did you learn a few things there? Did you learn a lot from that experience?
I did. And perhaps I think the biggest part of the learning are the things that I then realize way after the fact. At the speed of life, you don't really have the time to reflect on it. But later on, that above all else is authenticity. You will be right sometimes, you'll be wrong sometimes. But if you truly believe in what you are doing and you're authentic, you will then get people to buy into your story and they'll come along with you. If you know that the story you're telling is one that you don't believe, how on earth can you expect others to come along with you? And I think that's, again, something that I was fortunate enough to have, that I did believe that the things that we're doing were consequential. And so, yeah, I was able to lead a bunch of people on that dream with me.
We're speaking to Andile Mazwai on The Money Show. He's chair at Bidvest Bank. Of course, he's at Alexander Forbes, a director there, a CEO of CBD Investments as well. More conversation with Andile Mazwai in a moment.
7:02. Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Speaking to Andile Mazwai, the chair of Bidvest Bank, the CEO of CBD Investments. There was one, Alexander Forbes. He's a director there. We're talking about his journey with money. Andile, as you have moved through our society and you've watched things change, you've been a big part of that change, and you've moved into different, you've sort of moved into boards and things. Have you... the role that you play will have changed. Have you noticed big changes in our society as you've been moving through it? Some things are obvious, we can all see, but we can't all see everything. Are there certain changes you think that you've seen that maybe we don't talk enough about? Certain changes in the way people spend and make money? And please don't mention artificial intelligence.
No, I know nothing of such things. I don't think it's the way you're asking the question, but the way that I'm hearing it is, what's changed here in South Africa? We whether in a strategy session or the beginning of the year, and you're looking into your crystal ball into what might happen. There were always these perennial potholes, speed humps. And for me, this year, they weren't there. Load shedding wasn't there. Let's forget about last week. But load shedding wasn't there. Political uncertainty wasn't there. So many of the things that we're used to putting up as, I don't know, suddenly those weren't in the way. And I think I came into this year and I saw people coming into this year with a greater sense of conviction that the things that they're planning actually could and should work out. So I think a renewed optimism, not just on one thing, but perhaps in just a number of things and the things that we tend to worry about not being there.
That's a really interesting point, because I think sometimes we almost forget about what we've come through and where we are relative to that. So you've been working very hard. What do you like to spend money on? I'll tell you mine if you tell me yours.
I've got this idea that you got these youngsters that are listening and they're going to hear something good, but no. Squander. I've squandered lots of money on flashy cars. That's my kryptonite. That's my vice. If it's shiny and it goes vroom vroom, then I'm likely to buy it. And it makes no financial sense.
I'm worried that new cars won't make vroom vroom for much longer. They can go wee wee wee.
Possibly, but
the best money you've ever spent? Holiday, investment, experience, whatever.
Yeah, it was a holiday. Again, it was just an unbelievable opportunity. This would have been after we sold BJM. And so I was unemployable. Nobody felt sorry for me. Nobody thought, let's give this guy a job. He's like, yeah, he'll be fine.
Did you spend a lot of time in the garden?
I did. I managed to get to a very fancy garden in the south of France. So I was able to take a year off, a sabbatical, with the family in the south of France. In the knowledge that this is not normal, that this is not something that one does again in one's life. And so that every single day really was like a fairy tale. And just to be able to connect with one another, to just think freely, see the world differently, that was really, really a blessing. So yeah, spent all of that money, but don't regret a single euro.
I mean, there's some things, it's never going to happen again. You have to do it now.
Yeah.
It just is. Your role now, sitting on boards, running CBD investments, you've lived a lifetime, many years ago in some ways for a lot of people. They would certainly consider that to be a lifetime in terms of a career. What are your priorities different now to what they were then? I mean, then maybe you were commerce, try and get as much control over as many goods and services. Now it's a different vibe.
Yeah, it is. It's the time horizon. Trying to stay away from legacy and legacy. Now I'm not about to write a book. It's the time horizon that when I was younger, it was all about me here now. And certainly in a space like property, we own buildings that have been around for 30, 40 years. I look and think, in 30 or 40 years, will I still be here? And the answer is, I hope I'm not sitting behind this desk in that time. But it forces me to think of a time when I won't be behind the desk. I look at the youngsters who are with me in my team now and thinking, what future are we creating for them? And so that the time horizon changes, and it gives a great degree of purpose. There is a wonderful sense of purpose that the things that we're doing today will have a consequence and a resonance. Specifically, a lot of our buildings are tenanted by government entities, either directly or indirectly. I've never been a civil servant, but I've just gotten this feel of I'm serving my state. And there's a sense of pride that goes with that, to say, instead of complaining about this, that, or the other, there are now buttons on my desk which, if I press correctly, will actually improve situations, be it small or large. And so, yeah, there's a great sense of purpose that goes with something as otherwise mundane as owning a property and being a landlord.
And I suppose maybe a part of that is just, one sort of moves through life, there can be a greater sense of security or fulfillment's a better word maybe, in terms of what you're doing and why you're doing it. You kind of understand that what you did when you were younger, but you're actually much more interested in doing something that gives you a sense that you couldn't have ever achieved when you were younger.
No, you captured it well, fulfillment. That's really what it's about. Yeah, the frustrations are there. I pull my hair out, I kick and I scream, but fulfillment is really what it's about, yeah.
Looking back, you look at young people now, and so often, I'm tempted to despair because twice a week on this program we'll do a story about youth unemployment, and I look at where the world was when I came out of university. I'm maybe 6 months older than you, I think, and there were jobs. I mean, there were problems. I mean, This was before 1994, but there were jobs, and now they don't seem to be jobs, and that I think for younger people must just be absolutely devastating.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine what it must be like. What we've done though is in the small space that we're in, we've got a graduate program. If you go to a fancy university, yeah, sure, you'll get your job. But if your university is not a Ivy League brand name kind of university, it's true that people can get degrees and then not get jobs. And what is amazing is you just give these youngsters a chance. Rather than giving them a job, you give them a chance. And immediately my mind is just filled with the number of kids in the last 12 months who we put behind a desk, we just drove around with them, and they were the ones who saw the opportunities. So that they actually created work, they created opportunities as inexperienced as they were. And if I could use this platform to say to anybody in a position like mine, if you can have a youngster sit by your side, ride shotgun, just bring them along. You'll be amazed. Instead of you thinking that you're paying them for work that doesn't exist, I think you'll be amazed the extent to which their eyes open, so that instead of looking for a job or giving people jobs, just give them the opportunity and they will actually create the economic activity.
Andile, I've loved talking to you. Thank you so much for coming in. Really appreciate it.
Stephen, absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Andile Mazwai, and of course you know about his career and his life, currently chair at Bidvest Bank, a board member at Alexander Forbes and CEO of CBD Investments.
You're listening to The Money Show with Stephen Grootes, brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, reimagining inclusive and sustainable economic growth at Beyond the Budget 2025.
That's it for The Money Show. We're back, of course, tomorrow. Good evening. It's 8 o'clock.